Okay, so as we jump in here, first of all, we are going to talk about why onboarding matters. Truthfully, this is one of the most important things that you can do in your company because this is all about intentionality. When I started in the fireplace industry, I started working for a small fireplace company in a small town. And they were a good company. They loved their customers. They did the absolute best work that they could. But for me, there really wasn't a training process. I got called up. I was playing in a failing punk rock band at the time. I was called up and I went to go install a wood insert. And I didn't know what a wood insert was. I'd never seen one before I showed up that day. And I was just on the job doing it. And there is something to be said for just being a helper. And, hey, here's the wrench. Why don't you screw this in? Let's take a look at this. We're going to caulk this. There's a time and a place for that. But there was no type of training for me. It was just try to observe, do what you can. And even for me, at this company, I had to go for months before I even filled out I forget if it's a W-2 or a W-4, whichever one it is when you get hired. But it took months before I even filled one out because I was just a helper. And there wasn't a lot of intentionality behind it. Later on, I moved to a bigger city. I got hired by a very successful business that does great work. But it was kind of the same thing where, a month into the job, there was questions and confusion that I had. And my boss at the time was upset that I wasn't doing things a certain way. And I was like, well, I've never been taught this before. And he's like, well, I thought you installed. I thought you knew this. There's just all kinds of confusion around what is the expectation and how do I do my job? If you fast forward to other jobs I've had, there was a time where I just got basically dropped off into the middle of an empty showroom and it was like, hey, this is yours, have at it. And again, there's blessings to all of this, and that when you're forced to learn yourself, you do learn, but there's a pretty high casualty rate along with that. And so the way that we train and onboard a new hire it literally is a huge investment into your company, and it's one of the most important things that you can do. So no matter how big or small your company is, fortunately, I've been able to work for some amazing companies, and the last one, Fireside Home Solutions, is a big company that does just incredible work. And so we have a little bit more system and process to training. We have different departments. We have different department heads. And so there's a little bit more formality to it. If you're in a smaller company with just 3, 4, 5 people, man, no shame at all. You can take these same principles, and what it's going to do is it's going to elevate the status of your company. It's going to change the way that this new hire sees you. And they're going to start to give you the benefit of the doubt because of the intentionality and the professionalism that you use when you train them. So during this time, this initial onboarding time is going to mold impressions into your new hire that will never be undone. They really will never be undone. And the analogy I think about is somebody that's sculpting clay. So if I'm sculpting clay, there's a time where that clay is moldable and there's a time where it's not. And by the time the clay hardens, I can't do anything about it. Only God can, right? My job is done. That person is set. But when someone comes on board your company, they are soft clay that is moldable. So you have the ability to form them into whatever kind of team member you want them to be. And this is super, super important. I've found personally that as you start to make this investment in team members, what you're going to find is you start to mold them into the image of your company. And long term, if there's people that are complaining or talking behind your back or undermining the company, the team members that you onboarded the right way, that you've molded into your kind of team player, man, they will fight for your company. They'll start to self-police other team members. They'll give you the benefit of the doubt when things are hard because you have molded the right impression. But what happens a lot of the time is that team members come in, and if they're a salesperson, they go and sit by whoever the best salesperson is, or if they're a service tech, they just jump in the truck with Jimmy, or if they're an administrative person, they go and sit behind the counter. They observe, and what they observe is a lot of bad habits. and they don't get any kind of formalized training, right? Just because you know how to install something doesn't mean that you're a good teacher of installing something. Just because you can sell something doesn't mean that you're a teacher of how to sell. And just because you're good at selling doesn't mean that you understand even why you do it. So when someone new is coming in, if all they do is sit and observe without direction and molding, well, they're going to observe a bunch of bad habits. And so, 6 months later, a year later, if that team member is frustrated or burnt out or you feel like they're not performing, well, is it any wonder? It's because we didn't set the expectation from the beginning. We didn't do our due diligence of molding them into the kind of person that we want them to be. So I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but I'm telling you that it is so important to take this time and literally think about it as if like you are raising children, because with your team members, you get maybe a 6-month honeymoon period. Maybe it can go just a little bit longer, but for probably the first 6 months that they're with you, they're going to start to give you the benefit of the doubt. And what's going to happen as they get past that is that honeymoon's over. And so if there's frustrating things that happen in your company or different dynamics that they don't like, well, when the honeymoon's over, they're going to fall back on the initial impressions that they have of you, unless you're just totally black and white different and everything's terrible once they get in for 6 months. But generally speaking, if you're a person of goodwill and you run a good business, if you can train them in those first 6 months and really mold that impression, it's going to serve their attitude and demeanor for years to come.